Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. There is so much happening right now at the national level, which seems to be where a lot of people's attention is focused, but also here at the state level. And some of the more important things that are in front of the legislature this week, well, there's two things that I think will be very near and dear to most of our hearts and pocketbooks, and that is tax cuts as well as medical freedom. Now, this is not to say that the stuff happening at the national level isn't important. It certainly is. But you have much more influence and probably have a lot greater opportunity to influence policy here closer to home. So let's talk about tax cuts and medical freedom in just a few moments.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. You know, there are so many different stories that are going on any given week that sometimes it's a little bit tough to choose. What should we focus on? Where should we direct our attention? And for instance, you know, the legislature right now is considering a resolution honoring the Boise State women's volleyball team for their courageous stand in forfeiting games rather than play along with the lie that a man pretending to be a woman on the San Jose State University team, you know, they're just not buying into the whole woke ideology that says, well, he says he's a woman, so we have to play along like he is, especially when that means bringing men into women's spaces and having to dodge 70-mile-an-hour spikes right at their face. But anyway, honoring that team, that was something I considered talking about. I'm mentioning it in passing. Maybe I'll cover it a little bit later this week. There was also a protest apparently in Boise over this because despite this massive shift that we're seeing at the national level, where basically the woke nonsense is no longer backed by the full weight of the federal government, there are still people who insist that, no, you have to think this and you have to speak this and act this way or else. But let's talk a little bit about taxes and tax cuts in particular. I want to start with an article from Fred Birnbaum from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Of course, we can afford more tax cuts. Now, specifically, he's talking about 4 bills that are before the legislature at this time. One of them is actually a school choice tax credit, which I don't want you to get lost on it, but this could amount to a form of tax relief. And let's begin with the first bill and a little bit of an explanation of why we can afford to cut taxes. It's not like, oh my goodness, what will our government ever do? Fred says there's probably some confusion among the public concerning how much tax relief has been achieved. But he says after reviewing the data for the last 4 years, from 2020 to 2024, property tax relief has kept overall property taxes flat after accounting for the tax relief applied to schools and directly to homeowners. But he points out, to be clear, budgets are not decreasing. Sales taxes are just being shifted to cover property tax budgets. And there's a chart that he actually includes in the article, which you can find at idahofreedom.org, which shows where schools require less property taxes because they're getting more money from the state. And in the 4 years, the counties have increased their property tax take by 25%, while the cities have increased theirs by a whopping 40%. So his point is the spending problem hasn't been resolved. Essentially, we're just shifting money to provide tax relief. But let's look at the individual bills that are currently before the Idaho legislature. So these 4 tax cut bills, he says, total over $400 million if you include one-time tax cuts. Now, House Bill 40 is the most generous bill, providing ongoing relief of over $250 million by reducing the income tax rates from 5.695% to 5.3%. Also eliminating the capital gains tax on precious metal bullion. By the way, that's a good thought. And including a tax break for veterans' pensions. HB 40 passed the House on a 62-7 vote with a couple of Democrats, Representatives Theodore Achilles and Sonia Galaviz, breaking ranks and joining the Republican caucus that was unanimous in support of the bill. The next bill we're going to talk about is House Bill 61. Now, this is an increase in the tax credit, commonly known as the grocery credit, by up to $35 per person. Now, the $50 million increase doesn't keep up with inflation since the credit increased in 2022. And Fred says rather than increasing the grocery tax credit, it would make more sense to simply stop taking money out of Idahoans' pockets for sales taxes on groceries in the first place. Nearly every state has stopped doing this, but unfortunately, despite years of trying, that's not the bill described above. He says eliminating the sales tax on food would be a $400 million tax cut. Now, that would be a real tax cut. The next bill that he mentions is House Bill 74. This is a property tax bill providing $50 million of one-time relief to homeowners, directly to homeowners, and $50 million of ongoing property tax relief through the secondary effect of putting downward pressure on bonds and levies. And this is done with $50 million of additional money to the school district facilities fund. And finally, he says, our view on tax cuts that are on offer is just a starting point. He says, it was said during testimony in favor of HB 40, tax cuts were necessary to prevent the legislature from spending away the revenues. But he says, we disagree with that notion. Spending should be based on the proper role of government, on limited government, and all revenues that aren't necessary for its operation belong in the hands of the taxpayers who earned the money. I mean, that makes sense, right? That means additional tax cuts should be on the table. By the way, there is that one more bill, and this is the House Bill 93, the parental choice tax credit. And although it's a school choice bill that uses a tax credit as a vehicle to allow parents to pick the best education option for their children, that bill's limitations cap its costs at $50 million. Now, that's not the ideal school choice bill, but hopefully this is one of those times where we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of school choice. There's still quite a few days left in the Idaho legislative session, and it'll be interesting to see where that school choice goes. But the good news is there is movement, maybe not 100% and as fully in the direction of school choice as some of us would like, but it's definitely movement in the right direction. And of course, with President Trump issuing a directive to figure out how to dismantle the federal Department of Education, I know for statists that's a huge cause for concern. Oh well, who's gonna educate the children? Well, gee, I don't know. Wasn't it Jimmy Carter who introduced and who actually called into existence the Department of Education back in the 1970s? Seems to me that in that time we have not seen a substantial increase in the quality or the ability of government schools to deliver on educating our kids. In fact, if anything, the U.S. went from a fairly high position among the educated societies throughout the world to a much, much lower position. Now, that's not to say that education is bad in and of itself, but even Debbie Critchfield, who I believe is the superintendent of Idaho's public schools, says, well, more control for the state really isn't a bad thing. So she's open to the idea, but school choice would also mean that parents might say, yeah, the government-run school system, even if it's by the state, that's not something that I want to be a part of. Now, there is another form of tax relief that is also on the horizon. I just wanted to mention this one. Maybe we'll do a program on this one a little bit further down the road before the legislative session ends, if this one grows some legs. But there has been a bill introduced that would exempt small sellers from having to obtain a sales tax permit. Interesting. In other words, Idahoans who sell less than $5,000 worth of items would not have to collect or report sales tax. I don't know. Sounds like it might be a good way to encourage people to be entrepreneurial without all of the hassles of starting up a business and all the tax concerns that go into that. Now, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about medical freedom. Leslie Manookian was testifying today, and I have to tell you, this was some fascinating testimony. She talked about the Idaho Medical Freedom Act. Now, I believe this was introduced by Senator Foreman, and Leslie was testifying on behalf of this. She says, medical freedom is foundational to our nation, our Constitution, as well as our shared human dignity. The Idaho Medical Freedom Act, sponsored by Senator Dan Foreman, would restore this ethical principle in Idaho and ensure that Idaho stands as a beacon of liberty in declaring that no individual will be coerced into receiving a medical intervention against their will, with the exception of those organizations which receive CMS funds. It ensures that employment, education, entertainment, and public participation remain accessible to all, regardless of their medical choices. So she says the right to make one's own medical decisions is not granted by the government. And this gets down to the down and dirty about, well, where do those rights come from? Look, your natural rights are yours by virtue of the fact that you are a human being, period. Government doesn't give you those rights. It can only protect them or try to take them away from you. So it's not a privilege subject to approval. She says it's a sacred, God-given, inalienable, meaning inseparable from you, right, woven into the very fabric of our constitutional republic. And it's a right that has been consistently upheld by our Supreme Court. She actually goes into a number of cases and explains how they upheld this right. So this Medical Freedom Act is in no way radical, she says. It's just a codification of our basic human rights. But let's go into a little more detail. What does the bill actually protect? Well, under this act, no individual may be denied employment or forced to undergo a medical intervention as a condition of employment. Not that anybody would do that. Yeah, think back about 4 years ago. There was a lot of that going around, except in very limited circumstances involving federally funded entities. It's also no individual may be excluded from schools or universities for their personal and private medical decisions. No individual may be refused entry into public buildings or services due to their medical choices. I'm thinking back to when Ammon Bundy was charged with failure to appear at his court date, when he actually showed up, but they wouldn't let him in the courthouse because he refused to put on the mask. Just kind of a tricky way to, let's add some more charges. Let's add some more jail time. And it was totally unnecessary. Also, under this act, no individual may be discriminated against based on their medical choices. Now, Leslie Manoukian says, look, let us stand for liberty, let us stand for bodily autonomy, and let us ensure that Idaho remains a state where medical freedom is not negotiable. Because in a free society, it's not a privilege, it's a human right. And S 1023 will enshrine this most basic and sacred human right in law. I mean, I know we want to forget. We want to just put behind us the unpleasantness of the pandemic and all the stuff that was done to us. And yet look at some of the things that are coming out now, in part, thanks to the work of the Department of Government Efficiency, the things that they've uncovered, the backroom deals, the shadowy machinations that were done, without people's approval. No one consented to this. No one voted for it, yet it was still done to us. So there's some things that really need to be fixed. And this is one of those places where, again, at the state level, if you can get your state legislators to stand up for that, your own personal autonomy, you're standing on pretty firm ground. There may come a point where they have to interpose themselves between you and the federal government. But it sure would be good to have some tools on hand to make sure that government at any level isn't encroaching in your life in places where it really shouldn't. Anyway, a couple things there to be encouraged with. Again, tax cuts. Yes, we can afford more. Medical freedom. Yeah, we can stand a little bit more of that too. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.